I was recently contacted by someone who had some questions about a passage in one of Paul's letters. And it's a passage I've encountered before, both by people who had questions and skeptics who were using this as a reason to not believe in the historical Christian faith. And so the passage in question is from Galatians chapter 1, and it's verses 15 and 16. And in this, Paul says, "But when God, who had set me apart before I was born and called me through his grace, was pleased to reveal his Son to me." And it's that phrase, to reveal his Son to me. What in the world does that mean? Well, I have encountered this in some of my work with the Jesus myth theory. And if you're interested in that, check out my website, jesusmyththeory.com. And the Jesus myth theory claims that there was no historical Jesus. And so they have to deal with Paul. And they actually use that verse to argue that Paul never believed in a historical Jesus. The only Jesus that there was to experience was this spiritual experience, which he has described in Galatians. And this Jesus that he talks about is just a concept in heaven, a spiritual revelation that goes on and that people can have contact with, sort of a cosmic Christ, as some people have described it. And so they've used that to say that Paul never believed in a historical Jesus. And that's simply not true. There are a number of references in Paul's letters that demonstrate that he did believe that Jesus was a historical figure, someone who was descended from David, someone who was born of a woman. And there are a number of other passages as well. So that is not really a very good argument. But there still are some other questions about this. And this has to do with whether Paul actually met the risen Jesus. Can we use Paul as an eyewitness for the resurrection? And that's a really good question. And as someone who's very interested in the resurrection, I think about this quite a bit myself. And so when we look at this, the language that Paul uses in Galatians seems to be speaking of a revelation. In fact, the Greek word there for reveal is the same word we get apocalypse, which is the Greek word for revelation, as in the book of Revelation. And so I actually would like to read a fairly lengthy passage from Ben Witherington III, a highly respected New Testament scholar, and this is from his commentary, Grace in Galatia. And I find it very helpful what he has to say here. This is what he says on page 107 of this commentary. The verb apocalypsai, to reveal, coupled with the in me phrase, suggests that Paul is referring to his having received an apocalyptic vision of Christ. The terminology is different from what we find in 1 Corinthians 9:1, where we hear of seeing Christ. Paul, in all likelihood, would not agree with modern distinctions between objective and subjective revelations. If such terms had to be used, he probably would have insisted that his encounter on the Damascus Road was both objective and subjective. It was objective in that it came from God and from outside Paul's psyche. It was not an example of wish projection or fantasizing or dreaming, or even a mystical experience where the mystic achieves a certain kind of spiritual state of mind or being and then reaches out for something beyond himself or herself and sees something. On the other hand, it was also subjective because it was deeply personal. The revelation took place in Paul, in the very depths of his being, and not in others who may have been with him at the time. The language of vision from heaven, and so something which has to be unveiled or otherwise it would not be seen or known, comports with the accounts in Acts, which suggests that Paul saw Christ after he ascended to heaven, and so from heaven. And I think that that's really helpful to hear. And it may not be as comforting as someone who's looking for extra evidence for the resurrection of Jesus, but it is acknowledging something different happened with Paul. It wasn't exactly the same as what happened to the others. Now, it is similar, and I'm going to share in a moment how it was, but it was somewhat different, perhaps not from Paul's perspective and not from his view, but in the sense that it did not happen during that time in which the resurrected Christ was on earth and before the ascension. And so the Jesus that the other apostles encountered was one who could eat fish and walk around, and you could touch the wounds and put your hands in the holes where the crucifixion took place. And so it was a very physical Jesus that the other apostles were encountering. And I think that Paul, his experience of Jesus, he would say it was just as real, but it was different in a way. And it certainly was a different, at the very least, in the sense of timing. It was on the other side of the ascension. And so was this just a revelation? Well, I don't know that Paul would say just a revelation. It was a revelation, but Paul would have been absolutely convinced that that was the real Jesus that he was experiencing. And at the point in which it happens is not a time when he's seeking out any kind of mystical experience with Jesus, because he's a persecutor of the church. And there's no evidence to suggest that he was feeling guilty about that. But he has something so powerful that he is willing to step away from his previous way of life towards following Jesus, with no promise that he is ever going to be accepted by the church, and every reason to believe that he wouldn't be accepted by the church after having persecuted so badly many Christians. And so something powerful happened to him, something that he definitely considered real. It wasn't just a warm feeling inside thinking, maybe these Christians aren't so bad, or maybe Jesus, maybe he had something to him after all. Something more happened that Paul would make this radical change to walk away from one community with no promise of being embraced in the next community. And in that time, in that culture, being a part of community was everything. So I think that we can say that Paul experienced something, but was he a witness to the resurrection? Well, one of the other passages that is important for us to consider is 1 Corinthians 15. And in that chapter, Paul quotes an earlier account, a tradition that lists the witnesses of the resurrection. And the word appear happens over and over again. And we're told that Jesus appeared to 500. Jesus appeared to the 12. Jesus appeared to the other apostles. Jesus appeared to James. And Jesus appeared to Paul. And so I want to read one more short passage here. This is from Driver, Plummer, and Briggs, who wrote the International Critical Commentary on 1 Corinthians. And this is what they say. St. Paul uses the same word, ophthe, of the appearance to himself, as he uses of the appearances to others. He regards it as the same in kind. He saw the risen Lord as really as they did. Now, how does that fit with what I just said before? Well, when we look at it, we see the difference. We can look at it with our modern Enlightenment minds and say, somehow this was different, that the apostles saw Jesus just after coming out of the tomb with his body before ascension to heaven. And Paul has this spiritual experience where he has this vision of Jesus. And to us, those look to be somewhat different. But from Paul's perspective, they would seem to be just as real. And Paul would have argued, and we see this, we see little hints in Paul's letters where there are people who are questioning Paul's apostleship. Notice at the beginning of many of his letters, he argues very strongly that he is just as much an apostle as the others. And the question for many people were, well, what right does Paul have to be an apostle? They actually saw Jesus. Did Paul really see Jesus? And Paul would say, yes, I really saw Jesus. That it was just as real as anything that the apostles saw. And so his understanding of it is that they would definitely belong in the same category. But us as modern observers from the outside of that would recognize that there are some differences. Perhaps not qualitative differences, but differences in timing. And these are part of what we're wrestling with in this passage. How does this fit with Paul as a witness to the resurrection? Well, if I was arguing for the resurrection of Jesus and the historical reliability of that, I wouldn't rely as much on Paul. Not that I doubt Paul's experience. I would say that he did experience something very powerful enough to change his life the way we see. And that's something that we should take seriously. But if we're looking at things purely from a historical perspective, I think Paul's passage in 1 Corinthians 15, where he's talking about how Jesus appeared to Cephas, to the 500 and to the 12 and all of those things, I think that's the best place to argue from, because it could be argued that Paul had a vision of Christ, because he did have a vision of Christ. And whereas we might not see that as proving the resurrection in the way we would want, I think the ancients, the first readers of Galatians and 1 Corinthians, the first century church, they wouldn't have that separation of the supernatural and the natural the way we have it. And they would see Paul's experience as just as convincing as any of the others. But today we are talking to post-Enlightenment people. And so if I'm trying to argue for the resurrection of Jesus, and I do believe that there's good evidence for the resurrection of Jesus, I'm not going to rely as much on Paul. I will rely on the others because I believe it is more convincing to our audiences today. So I hope that helps in explaining what is going on. So in conclusion, what Paul says in Galatians chapter 1 is not that he didn't believe in Jesus or he thought Jesus was only a heavenly being. He definitely addresses Jesus as a heavenly being, because that is the point in history in which he had a relationship with Jesus post-ascension. So Jesus was a heavenly being at that point, but he is definitely aware that Jesus was a human being as well. And we can see that throughout Paul's letters. And in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul recounts the appearances to others as well as the appearance to him. And he understands that something was a bit different, but he believes it's qualitatively just as reliable as what happened to the other apostles, and therefore his apostleship is just as valid as theirs. I hope you come and visit me at my website, StephenJBedard.com. And if you're interested in the apologetics aspect, go to StephenJBedard.com/apologetics. Thank you, and God bless.